is the capacity to remain engaged, to remain attentive to others and to institutions over time, and to act in ways that matter, even when systems around you are slow or resistant to changes. So all of this matters right now because the context in which we make case for international education has changed across the globe. Across many countries that host the largest number of students globally, the political conversation has recently narrowed. Students are increasingly discussed, as many of you know, in terms of migration numbers, labor markets, public cost, and security. Governments fund scholarships with one hand and impose some of these restrictions with another. So the idea that international education is a public good is still alive now, but it is under massive pressure. This panel sits directly in that context. We have here, in alphabetical order, Brendan Harrison, who leads research and evaluation at the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission and the Association of Commonwealth Universities, organizations whose entire mission rests on the claim that mobility matters. Hennessey, who heads the scholarships unit at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, overseeing the UK's flagship scholarship schemes and programs. Andreas Hoeschen, who directs the DAAD London office. As many of you know, DAAD is Germany's principal vehicle for academic exchange and one of the most significant and one of the largest scholarship schemes in the world. Joonghyun Kwak, who is assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin, worked with me on the project that I mentioned and brings that evidence as well as his own research. And Jenna Mittelmeier, senior lecturer in international education at the University of Manchester, who leads some of the most critically rigorous work in our field. And finally, Hans de Witt, who is joining us online. He's emeritus professor of practice at the International Higher Education at Boston College, and is one of the foremost scholars of internationalization in the world, someone who has watched, shaped this space for longer than anyone. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us. And we will try to bring together perspectives from policy, research, and funding. And I will start with my first question. What do you believe international education, international student mobility and scholarships are fundamentally for? Who wants to start?
I can start,
Please.
I'll start from the perspective of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. And the first thing I'd say is it's not just about educating people, because if it was just about educating individuals, it's a very expensive and slow process to use a global education program to educate enough people to make a real difference. So for us, it's about educating future leaders because we believe they have an amplifying effect. So one individual will go back, just as your example, Maia, will go back and find themselves in a position of influence where they can improve the lives of their communities, their cities, their countries. So we're looking at it from the point of view of individuals who have a disproportionately large effect because we're looking for future leaders. And the sort of specific reasons we fund scholarships, partly it's about development. Most of our funding for scholarships in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as Brendan knows, because he's one of the programs we fund is the Commonwealth, it's a development aid funded. So we expect the impact to happen back in the home countries. So we want our scholars to go home and have an impact back at home. So development is a really important driver for us. Growth is another important driver, both generating income in the UK, but also when they go back home, getting into positions where they can help their country to become more affluent and individuals to become better off. And then finally, soft power. We hope that people who come to study in the UK go home again with a nice warm feeling about the UK. They might still think Brits are a bit odd, but they understand us a little bit better than maybe they did when they arrived, and they retain, we hope, a fondness for the UK and a willingness to sort of engage with us in the longer term. So that's why I fund, or the Foreign Office funds, scholarships. Thank you.
Excellent. Who wants to go next? Joonghyun?
Maybe next. Yes, I totally agree with the Emma's thinking. So actually, I think that the international higher education is international mobility is the circulation of human capital across borders. And also it is shaped by economic and geopolitical interest. So from student side, actually studying abroad will give them the skill improvement, and also it might be used as a thing, a very basic route for pathway to migration. Sometimes from university side, actually it is a big source for income. And from government side, actually, they try to include talent, and also they want to actually improve their national competitiveness through international mobility. But I think scholarship, as Emma talked, because scholarship shows very clear evidence of this argument. So actually, scholarship shows that it is for the mutual exchange and also development. But also, as soft power like this, actually, it is related to national interest. For example, Commonwealth scholarship, actually, they profess that it is for the sustainable development, but also you can influence on the Commonwealth countries after colonial period, right? So also look at the data actually in the 1960s or in the past, the proportion of the recipients in Africa is very limited, but it has increased. Nowadays, actually, it accounts for the biggest portion in the scholarships. But you can find very similar pattern in the ECA Fulbright scholarships. So from 1960s and 2020, actually the lowest recipient in around the world is African students. So if this scholarship for inter-student mobility is purely for the development, actually these scholarships or any funding should go to the regions with greater need. But the current situation is totally different. So I think that this international mobility is global circulation of talent, but of course there is educational development benefit are real, but it is actually embedded and shaped by national interest and geopolitical interest in the host country.
Thank you, Brendan.
Well, no, I think makes sense. We're going in a pattern. So personally, I see international student mobility as a way for individuals to learn, to grow, to encounter different perspectives, ways that are difficult to replicate in other types of contexts. And this has a number of benefits, both to the individual and at the more social level. Individually, this type of mobility creates opportunities to access learning that they might not otherwise be able to access in their sort of home context. It provides them with opportunities to learn about different sort of academic approaches and knowledge or intellectual approaches to things. It also exposes them to different sort of social norms or cultural contexts that they wouldn't otherwise be able to experience, including sort of everyday realities that are part of just living in a different place. And it also provides them with sort of subject knowledge about that and a certain amount of cultural literacy or intercultural competency that they might have. It creates an opportunity to build better understandings between cultural contexts and societies. So sustained contact in classrooms, workplaces, communities helps people sort of have a better, deeper understanding of other parts of the world and how other people think and interact with each other. And this applies both to people who are recipients of scholarships or undertake international mobilities, but it also applies to the classrooms where they're learning. Students in that classroom get that benefit as well. They get to learn about other countries, they get to learn sort of other ideas and ways of approaching problems from other settings that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I think so that's kind of mobilities broadly. I think scholarships are particularly for providing their access and equity oriented. They're for providing those opportunities to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to access them or afford them. So it's about sort of broadening opportunities to people. And at the social level, what this does is it creates sort of repeated, meaningful connections between people, between institutions. These links often endures professional networks, collaborations, partnerships, and even sort of broad global community ties. And I think this helps create a more interconnected society. I think it helps to build mutual understanding between countries. And as Emma mentioned, for the Commonwealth scholarships and other programs that have development orientations, they can act as drivers of positive social change.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'm going to speak directly to scholarships. And I think in answering Maia's question, I was torn, as I am in most of my work, between cynicism and hope. And I think the critical academic side of me approaches this from a quite cynical perspective, and that scholarships are often used as kind of manipulative markers of prestige and image making, both on a national country level, but also on an institutional level. Institutions and governments have historically, if we look back over 100 plus years, have historically used scholarships as tools of things like what my colleagues have mentioned, soft power, marketing, the intention of presenting a country as a globally desirable place or a globally open place. I think a modern example of that are humanitarian scholarships, which we have seen in the UK over the last couple of years in reaction to things like the Taliban resurgence in Afghanistan or the genocide in Palestine, where many institutions now have, these open humanitarian scholarships, which are maybe 1 or 2 scholarships that are highly competitive and are really, if we think about the humanitarian crises that they're aimed to address, they're a drop in the bucket in comparison to the global need. And in a way, I think the cynical side of me, again, sees these humanitarian scholarships as rather self-serving for institutions, rather than addressing the systemic inequalities across our world. And a truly humanitarian approach would do something more radical, like completely waive tuition for students from these contexts, or if that's too radical, perhaps reduce international fees to home student fees, or be thinking about removing access to barriers like proving entry requirements or English language tests, or etc. So there's that side of me, I think, in this conversation that is approaching this by thinking that I'm skeptical in our current system's ability to approach international student scholarships through a truly humanitarian lens, when international student recruitment is designed in many of our common host countries to be exploitative by nature. And I think many of these scholarships on an institution level oftentimes are trying to counter that image of exploitation. I started with the negative because I wanted to end on the positive. Because there's a hopeful side of that to me, and I think the humanist in me is thinking about how these scholarships are a lever for opening access to global higher education. We don't use the language of widening participation when it comes to international students very often, although in the UK we use that language when we talk about home students. But international scholarships, international student scholarships are a widening participation mechanism without being called that. And I think I'm reflective that on an individual level, they are changing lives. And that certainly has been my experience. I wouldn't be here today, I think, if I hadn't received an international scholarship as a PhD student a number of years ago. And it, has the space to open opportunities in terms of what is possible for individual students' futures, but also on an interpersonal level, as Brendan was speaking about as well. And I think it's that hopefulness, which is why many of us get into international higher education to begin with. We become interested in it because we don't want to lose the hope that what we are doing is meaningful on an interpersonal and intercultural level. But I still maintain that humanitarian hope with an eye of suspicion, which I hope to maintain throughout this session today. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yeah, and I'm very much tempted to directly follow up on your cynicism in a way. But first of all, I would like to, of course, underline that the DAAD has always believed in the transformative effects of international mobility of academics. And the DAAD published its new strategy 2030 last year and deliberately chose to keep our decades old motto, change through exchange. We truly believe in this, and we think there's a lot of evidence to support this claim. But coming back to what you have said, I mean, we in Germany, we don't charge tuition fees. We don't waive them. We don't charge them in the first place. But I would say this is also because of self-interest. There is an economic rationale behind it. And international students in general, I'm not talking about scholarship holders now, international students coming to Germany contribute massively to the German economy. And with a view to the demographic development, we will need the competence and the input of many international students. We would be able to do without them. And our government understands this and supports the DAAD, which is also in charge of the internationalization of German universities through various programs to help international students to find their way into the German labor market. However, I don't think that this is cynicism, because it's a choice, and some of our scholarship programs are, well, designed to allow for an institutional support of the home universities of our scholarship holders. So there has to be a balance, of course, and brain circulation, brain drain. This is a very important discussion. And of course, the DAAD is also committed to advancing UN sustainable development goals. And this is all not trivial, how to reconcile and balance out these different approaches. But this is exactly what we try to deal with. And coming back to the DAAD strategy I mentioned, of course, we have to deal with a world which is much more volatile and where there are security concerns and other factors at play, which we didn't see 10 years ago, I would say. So this is also something which affects international mobility of academics.
Thank you so much. And let's give maybe opportunity to Hans if he wants to contribute. Could you unmute him, please?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the contribution so far. And sorry not to be able to join you, but at the same time, I'm now here at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou in China. And that gives me a lot of experience on the topic this morning when I was teaching at the College of Education, both to Chinese students who have been abroad and international students who are at Zhejiang. And so if you talk to them, you see really the benefits that the individual has from an experience abroad. They learn to think out of the box, they learn to compare, to analyze, they have a completely different cultural experience. So from a student perspective, study abroad and scholarships are very effective. They really have a good experience. But of course, the benefits for others might be more challenging. And then I concur a little bit with what Jenna Mittelmeier has said about the negative aspects as well, because there was many countries and institutions have self-interest in scholarships and in having international students, not so much for the students' interest, but for the national development, also an important issue in China, but also, of course, in other parts of the world. Talent recruitment, talent development, a very important topic these days. Also in a country like Germany these days, where international students are seen as talents to recruit for the shrinking skilled labor in the local market. So that is very important. And we have seen that you have then to select, because policies in the past for scholarships by governments. We have the example of Science Without Borders in Brazil, back at Chile, and even all here in China, with ample scholarships for African students without really looking into why are you giving the scholarships and what is the impact, not only on the individual student, but also on the home and the host country of those students. There have been a lot of failures in that. So you have to make a good balance, in my view, about benefits of scholarships, to look at the needs of the individual, but also to look at the needs of the country they come from and the country they go to, and find a right balance in that. And that is in many scholarships programs, unfortunately, not very effective. And that has a negative impact on why international students are perceived. So we have to be much more clearer in that. It looks very nice when you give scholarships to students, but if they are not really getting the good quality education in the host institution, when they're not having a career perspective, or when they're not having the previous qualifications to have scholarships, then some things go completely wrong. And I was recently in Brazil for the new Capes Global program, where they really have learned from Science Without Borders that there was no infrastructure to select the students very well for scholarships. The host institutions in the UK and other countries were mainly interested in the money and not so much in the international students. So that was a complete failure. And they have learned now the lessons in the new Capes Global program to see, well, we have to be much more selective. We have to look at what is the interest for the institutions, what is the interest for the country and for its national development. So that, I think, are very important to distinguish, not only for the individual benefits, but also the benefits much more at the national and the global level.
Thank you so much, Hans. Excellent contributions. Moving on. So I will just ask the next question just to one or two members of the panel to move on to more complex questions. So what do you think? Maybe I would ask Andreas, if that's okay. What do you think has changed most in the conditions of mobility over the past 5 years or so? And which of those changes do you think globally matter most at the moment? Because you mentioned changes in the last 10 years also when you respond to the previous question. So what do you think has changed most?
Well, looking back at the last 5 years, first of all, global volatility, if I may just mention many developments, but mention just two events. In 2021, Brexit came into force, and I'm speaking now from the German perspective, of course, and this affected academic mobility to and from Germany significantly, in this case, especially from Germany. So the number of German degree-seeking students coming to the UK has decreased significantly, more than 50%. Fewer students now at UK university, but even more concerning for us, for the DAAD as a membership organization of German universities, was that the opportunities for credit mobility decreased also when, on top of Brexit, the UK left the Erasmus Plus program. And we tried to mitigate these developments, and that the DAAD is the national agency for the Erasmus Plus program in Germany, and it's a technical thing, but it was important that 20% of the Erasmus budget of German university, of all Erasmus participants, can be used for partner land mobility with countries outside the Erasmus region. And it was interesting for us to see that a significant high proportion of these funds have been used to fund mobility to the UK. So, and we are really grateful for UK universities to allowing for these exchanges without charging tuition fees, because this is a clear condition of Erasmus credit mobility. And we are, of course, delighted that this last week the UK signed up to reassociating or reassociated already itself to the Erasmus Plus program for 2027. And so things are not irreversible, we learned. However, there are other things much more complicated, a different category. In 2022, you all know a terrible event when Russia invaded Ukraine. This has Germany and the DAAD very close contact with Russian universities, institutions, and so on. But this had to stop instantly, and we had full stop of German students and researchers going to Russia, regardless of that topic. At the same time, the number of Russian students and early career researchers coming to Germany has been stable because we left the door open. However, in January this year, our organization, the DAAD, was declared an undesirable organization by the Russian authorities. It happened to the British Council years earlier. And so I'm not too optimistic that we will be able to maintain this bridge, which existed until has existed until now. These are changes which can happen very abruptly. Of course, these geopolitical changes, and we have to deal with it. And we as a DAAD are committed to a principle of open academic exchange with all countries, if it's possible, if it's responsible. And Maia, if I may borrow one phrase you coined, in one of your articles, you wrote that international mobility is, I think, the infrastructure, a long-term infrastructure of open societies, and we really believe in this. So that's to global mobility. And one other thing I would like to very briefly mention is something which is in a way even more complicated to understand. These are, we observe long-term changing patterns of mobility. Most students now clearly favor short-term mobility, and this is I think there are many factors at play, from the financial costs of study to new technological options for blended mobility. But we have to adapt, and we are doing this, our program portfolio to allow for BIPs and coils. But we also have to think how the transformative approach can be maintained, and how can we embed these new more shorter mobility formats into institutional frameworks which are sustainable.
Thank you so much. I wondered if Hans wanted to add anything to this. Hans, do you have anything to add on what has changed in the last 5 years globally, or even in the US or China?
Well, I think we are facing a very fundamental changes in different ways in mobility. We see, and that happened already before COVID and before the geopolitical tensions and the nationalist policies of anti-immigration in the high-income countries. But now it goes very fast. We see sending countries like China, India, Korea, and others, Malaysia, becoming also receiving countries. That's a very fundamental change. So we see that where the mobility was south-north mobility, it is now becoming much more south-south mobility. We see that countries have targets in many countries, in particular in Asia, of having a lot of international students coming to their countries. That is a very fundamental change. We see that also there's much more mobility within the regions. Many international students to China come from the regions or come from Africa. They don't come from the global north. In Latin America, we see a lot of regional mobility happening from different countries to Mexico, to Brazil, to Chile, and also to other countries, in particular at the graduate level. So there is a fundamental shift that mobility has become a global phenomenon with much more moving from the north to in particular to Asia and within the different regions. So that's one thing. As a reaction to that, and we had a conference for the DAAD last week in Berlin, where I was participating and giving a presentation about if countries don't receive any more international students, what they do, they send their programs abroad. So we see an increase in transnational education. We see branch campuses, we see the development of binational university, we see franchise operation, articulation programs, educational hubs developing in, for instance, Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. We see universities that have branch campuses like China from abroad also setting up branch campuses elsewhere. So we see also a fundamental shift where more students now will be in transnational operations than will be going abroad for mobility. The UK is a clear example. I mean, it has been clear now that there are 600,000 international students in the UK, but there are also 600,000 already in transnational operations of UK universities. UK universities, even from the Russell Group, want to go to India to set up branch campuses. So we see a fundamental change in the whole panorama of mobility, and that is going very fast and will continue. And it will be at the cost of what is going into international students in the high-income countries, in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, certain European countries, in Australia, at the price where there's much more international mobility going to countries like China, etc. So that, I think, are two fundamental changes that are happening in the past 5 years and continue to change even more in the years to come.
Thank you. I will now move on to the next question, which is about evidence-informed policy. And my question has two different parts, I think. So first of all, could our speakers tell us a little bit about what kind of evidence shapes decisions on international student mobility and scholarships in particular? And where is the gap that they can see between what research shows and what policy uses? So you can use any context you are familiar with or more global. Yes. Would you like to start, Brendan?
Sure. So specifically, when it comes to scholarships, I think the evidence that carries the most weight is sort of performance of the program. So is the program offering kind of value for money, and is the program able to demonstrate that it's delivering against stated objectives? So value for money can often be a bit fuzzy, but I think in this context, it's to what extent does the program sort of reflexively, how much is it looking inwards at itself to make sure that processes are effective, that the things that they're doing are having the intended outcomes, that what are the ways in which it could be done better or more efficiently or effectively. And as I said, are they doing what they're meant to be doing? Are the outcomes, outputs, long-term impact, the things that the program is meant to be doing? Or is there, if there's not any evidence to support that, then there's a legitimate question as to why are you doing this program and spending this money? I think secondly, decisions or evidence around how the program is supporting broader government priorities is important. So not just how well is the program doing what it's meant to be doing, but how well is it fitting into the larger government policy context. So if you think about kind of the program that we've talked about a little bit, this Commonwealth scholarships, to what extent is this program kind of delivering on UK's climate goals? To what extent are they supporting girls and women's education, economic development, both in sort of low middle income countries, but also economic development and growth in the UK? And I think if you're able to show that it's supporting the broader direction of the government, that evidence can be quite compelling as well. More broadly, how that fits into policy, I think, without foreshadowing too much to future parts of this discussion, I think the policy context is quite difficult because of how much mobilities and international scholarships are now overlapping with the migration debate and how sort of politicized and toxic that's almost become. So you can have all the evidence in the world that shows that it's performing and it's value for money and it's supporting broader government goals. But as soon as you start to get into that other space, as soon as you get that overlap, the extent to which that evidence is part of the decision making, I'm not so sure about. So it's not there.
Thank you, Brendan. Maybe Jenna and Joonghyun could give
I think I would maybe build off of what Brendan was talking about. I think the greatest threat to international higher education is that increased politicization of mobility across many of our common host countries, where we are seeing increased visa precarity, where it has perhaps never been more difficult to get an international student visa in many countries, but also the increased levels of surveillance that is happening to students upon arrival, the fewer post-study work options, the experiences of discrimination and general experiences of unwelcome within these anti-migrant discourses. And I think that intersection of education with visa regimes is then in turn influenced by governments' reactions to kind of anti-migrant discourses that are present within our societies. I think it's probably quite overlooked within our field in terms of the lack of systematic data about public sentiments towards international students. And oftentimes there's a reliance on these kind of imperfect litmus tests through the media or through the protests that we are seeing in the UK, for example, on the streets, which are assumed to represent the whole, where these loud discourses are assumed to become common. And I think as a field, we tend to focus on the things that Brendan had mentioned about the perceived or the monetary value of hosting international students and the values to our economy and to our communities. But xenophobia is not logical, and that's doing nothing to disrupt many of these issues that we're seeing within our society. So I think there's a wider question there about how, as researchers, are we developing data which provides a more authentic picture of public sentiments to our governments. And I'm not sure as academics we know what data governments need in order to react in a more humanitarian, authentic way.
I don't
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I think the policy is based on impact, or outcomes, right?
Mhm.
So maybe they should use simple and feasible indicators of the impact. The one evidence is just the number of students, international students, or economic contribution based on modern productivity. So actually, all the policies are based on this instant or short-term effect of the international student, especially in the host countries. So it is very hard to capture the long-term impact on home countries or host countries, because in the research area, we talked about many long-term impact or cultural influence and political influence in host and home countries, especially based on, I think, qualitative data. But in the policy side, actually, it is very hard, and also they need very tangible evidence, numbers. So I think the policy should is based on this short-term and host country national data, but in research area we are using various data sets, but it is very hard to capture what they actually need in the policy making. I think that is the gap between the research and policy areas.
Emma, did you want to add anything on this?
I suppose working for FCDO, I'm one step back. So when we're thinking about what shape the decisions, it's my job to make a case through a spending review process for why we should have money for scholarships. And I will base that on the things I believe the government thinks are important. So I will be thinking about climate change, impact on climate change, impact on our bilateral relationships and regional relationships, ability to influence through multilateral organizations, women and girls, development outcomes. So I'm sort of one step back in terms of how do I persuade ministers that it's worth investing in scholarships? And I'll be looking at what our government priorities are and trying to sort of direct my narrative to support as many of those as possible. And I have to say, despite the challenges we're facing, particularly on the development budget, which has shrunk, we have done surprisingly well with scholarships, and the investment is still pretty large compared to a lot of other programs across FCDO, because ministers recognise how important it is. For countries we have good relationships, for countries we have bad relationships with, we still fund scholars coming from Russia, for example. Not very many, but ministers believe it's important to keep funding countries where we have challenging relationships. So, it's slightly distracting, but yeah, so I'm sort of one step back. How do I make a good case with evidence? And very interested in long-term impact, because that is something that we do try to report. And Maia's given examples, and I have loads of examples of people who decades later are doing things that help our bilateral relationships. But yeah, it's an area I'd like to be able to do more in.
So basically, from what I understand, especially through our, exchanges, etc., qualitative evidence is no less important than numbers.
In fact, in some ways, qualitative evidence where you talk about case studies chimes better with when you talk to a minister. If I can say we've had 2 Nobel Prize winners, or we've had this many heads of state, or this, we have a scholar who went back to Armenia and got a job in the equivalent of the sort of work department and raised the national minimum wage for all Armenians. That's made every Armenian better off than they were before. One scholar did that. That sort of story really resonates because you can see the impact individuals have. So absolutely, qualitative data is really important.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, yes, please,
Yeah,
Andreas.
I would like to just add one thought to the impact question. I mean, the DAAD, as I mentioned, is also the National Agency for Erasmus, and in 2024, we published an impact study of Erasmus mobility that clearly showed that Erasmus participants had a significantly higher interest in participating in the European elections average age group. And this clearly relates to the aim of the Erasmus program of strengthening democratic participation. And we are very confident that the European Commission, which has also, like British, UK government, also German government, the approach of evidence-based policy making, we will take this into consideration. But this, of course, doesn't guarantee that the next Erasmus budget will meet all our needs. And this is a much more complex process, of course. But I think impact studies are even more important than they used to be, because we have also a much more complex public debate. And you mentioned migration and what is migration? Irregular, or is it migration in the labor market, or is it international student mobility? 3 very different beasts. I think so. Yeah, and we are very grateful, of course, for the contribution of your center, because this is also very, very helpful also for the DAAD.
Thank you so much. So this leads us to the next question, and most kind of critical question in this conversation, I think. So there are migration restrictions in many Western countries, many larger scholarship funders, Canada, USA, UK, Australia. We see migration restrictions. At the same time, these countries continue to fund, thankfully, most of their scholarships. So what are we looking at in these situations? Is it a contradiction? Is it a tension? Is it simply just 2 different policy functions operating in parallel to each other? Whoever wants to comment and explain and shed light to these situations, we will appreciate.
I'm happy to start, if I may, Maia.
Yes, please.
Yeah. I think there are contradictions, and that's always in politics, that there are contradictions, and different ministries have different contradictions. Foreign Affairs wants to have scholarships for soft power development. Internal Affairs don't see international students as immigrants, and they don't want immigrants, so they block that. The Ministry of Education wants to have different rationales. That is very typical, and that is not unique for this current situation, but has only become more increased. I think the biggest tension currently in the political environment with respect to international students is that the private sector and looking at the demographic factors needs talents, and there's a shortage of talents in different countries. That applies to the United States, to Canada, to the UK, to the European context, Australia, but also in China. We foresee in 2030 big shortages of skilled labor. So we need to have a competition for talents happening as a driving force. And that goes against the current climate of visa regulations to stop immigrants, international students as immigrants. So this tension will go on for a while, but I think at the end, the talent recruitment factor will be winning that battle. You see already the tensions between somebody like Elon Musk and Donald Trump on these issues. We see similar tensions when there were restrictions in the Netherlands about number of international students, that the private sector said, particularly the tech companies, we need those international students, otherwise we cannot economically compete. So they had to change that. Denmark first restricted international students, but then came to the conclusion that is a very big mistake. We have to change our policy and welcome them. I think at the end that will what is happening, but maybe too late, because as I said before, those students go already elsewhere. And they find a much more welcoming environment, as Jenny Mittelmeier has said, than they find in our countries. They don't want to be seen as in xenophobia atmospheres, as illegal immigrants, etc. So we are really on the wrong track in high-income countries, and we need to change that, otherwise we will be in danger.
Thank you. So the talent point's an interesting one, because in the UK, there are parts of the government system who want to attract international students to build talent in the UK, and their schemes to bring the most talented scholars into the UK. The schemes I'm responsible for, we want our scholars to go home. So that's not the Home Office telling me to send our students home. We want them to go home because the funding for the schemes comes from the development budget, and we can't count it as development if the scholars don't go home. So there is a tension there where sometimes other parts of Whitehall focus on most brilliant scholars, and how can we keep them in the UK? And I have to say, sorry, we want to send them home. So it's not just a Home Office issue. It is also depends where the funding comes from issue.
No, and that's a very valid point. I mean, that tension exists as well. And of course, we have to be careful, because if we say, well, we need those talents, we basically stimulate brain drain again, and we don't need to do that. So we have to find a right balance there as well between the talents that we need and the talents that have to go home to their countries.
And that's particularly acute in health sector, especially in the UK.
Yeah. Also Germany. I mean, Germany has a shortage of nurses, and what they do, they are now building programs in Tunisia, in Albania, etc., to train nurses to speak German, to prepare them for nursing in a German context, because they need them to come to Germany. So, and Ireland does the same with the Philippines. I mean, there's a lot of things already happening in that sense, which we have to be much more aware of.
And to sort of jump off from that, I think in the UK context, these scholarship programs are in a stronger position as far as being able to push back on that idea that they're in place to draw talent in and to sort of facilitate this brain drain when it is meant to be development oriented. Because there are other programs that I've spoken to where it is a development-oriented scholarship, but the other parts of the government where they are trying to draw this talent into their economy have a greater sway over that. And so they come and say, how do you guys get your people to go back and do the development work that we want them to do? So there's an interesting contrast there. I think the other well, another policy area that's important to consider here is, I'm thinking particularly about the UK, Canada, and Australia at this point, is the stagnation that's happened when it comes to public funding of universities. This has been going on for a long, long time, and for a long time, the way to address that was to plug the gap with international mobility and students that can come and pay much higher fees than home students would be able to in order to sort of help support university finances and subsidize the spaces for home students. And that came up a lot in the funding issue came up a lot in the lecture this morning. And now all of a sudden, with the migration and immigration debate and policy becoming more and more overlapped with this, you're getting, all of a sudden these countries are saying, okay, well, we need to reduce the number of international students that we have coming. Universities that have huge, huge gaps in their finances all of a sudden that they were previously able to plug with the tuition that these students were bringing in. But then again, I think it's, to get back to your original question, I think there are two policy areas that are operating in parallel. So the government's aware and supportive of scholarship programs, but as the migration and immigration debate has become more and more pronounced, and I think toxic is a good word for it, and less nuanced. So when you ask what's the difference between an irregular migrant or a regular migrant or labor market mobility, there's no space for that kind of nuance in the discussion that's happening right now. So the government is first and foremost interested in getting elected. So the short-termism that's happening there in trying to win votes with policy positions that are not necessarily supportive of scholarships or mobility or things like that is really starting to impede on this space. And I think it's just that that's being given more primacy than anything else at this point.
Anyone else wanted to develop with that?
Maybe just briefly to add to that, I think there's a fundamental contradiction in the way that many governments want to position themselves outwardly and inwardly. Where outwardly many governments want to position themselves as globally open and globally desirable, while inwardly wanting to present themselves as tough on migration. And those rhetorics are fundamentally, they can't coexist. But the audiences for those messages and who is paying attention to these conversations are different. So in a way, I think there's a space to get away with that contradiction. But I think that contradiction is probably the most important challenge facing our sector for the next 5 to 10 years.
Indeed. Thank you so much. I have a question about the future. Andreas, did you want to add anything?
Well,
And then
I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to, from a German perspective, the migration, there is also sometimes emotional migration debate, and also there are concerning rhetoric play sometimes, but it's very much in Germany focused on irregular migration, so it doesn't affect so much what we do as a DAAD with student mobility. But there's another debate, and I think it's also in the UK, but maybe more in Germany. This is about security issues, and this is very much about the tension between on the one hand, the benefits of international exchanges in research collaboration, starting with master's students, and on the other hand, a political objective of technology sovereignty and growing security demands against the background, of course, of the new research superpower China and how to deal with it. And we as a DAAD, we think it's necessary to take this very seriously and understand stronger political and public focus on research security, but also try to reconcile this with the indispensable approach of international cooperative openness in academia. And we think it's important that these issues being dealt with by the academic community themselves.
Thank you so much.
Maybe
Yes, Hans.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, the security issue is a very important topic, huh? And we see that that also has an impact on mobility, because we see that governments now restrict certain countries because of security issues, including the United States on students from China and scholars from China, because they think that they are stealing our knowledge. That is also a part of the policy. And of course, I absolutely agree with my German colleague that we should not politicize security. Security is important, but has to be left to the academics. And what is happening is politicization. Even when I talk here to the Chinese students, they ask me, why do the United States consider Chinese students a spy? Why are we considered now a spy? They really are worried about that. And I said, yeah, exactly, that is very hypocrite. Because first we invite them, we even make money out of them because we charge them tuition fees. Then we give them the knowledge that they need, and then they go home and then they use the knowledge, and then suddenly they become spies. This seems to be a little bit exaggerated. So we have to be very careful about this topic. We have to understand that, yes, we have to be having some knowledge security, and the academics have to play an important role in institutions, but we don't have to lead it over to politicians to do that. I absolutely agree with that.
Excellent. I propose that we open the floor to questions and maybe keep 6-7 minutes at the end so that our panel members can tell us a few things about the future, what they hope how things will change in future. So any questions or comments, please say who you are, your institution, and try to be brief so that we take as many questions as possible, please.
Okay. Thank you so much. And my name is Christine Orlando. I recently became a doctor just last week. University of Warwick in Coventry. And it's so amazing to get to hear from you as representatives of the organizations that give scholarships. I'm a recipient of the Commonwealth Scholarship. And so thanks to you, Brandon and Emma, for the plug. And one thing I noticed is that, okay, from the discussions, the benefits of the scholarships are broad and diverse in nature. There's the issue of culture and opening up to the world and all of that. But it's good for me to also, as a scholar who's benefited from this scheme, to give the perspective from my end, which I think is very informative, because I think one of the benefits of a scholar is in getting the scholarship is that it can really, really amplify the quality of the research that one does. So for instance, I did a thesis on the right to higher education and certification, and I examined how the concept of certification within an understanding of the right to higher education affects the learning environment. I exposed the power dynamics that exists between lecturers and students. And I come from a background in Kenya where I'm a lawyer. I taught law in some Kenyan universities. And I also studied my undergrad in Kenya. And so I have both insider perspectives, and I wanted now to study from an expert perspective. But doing my PhD in a Kenyan university, I imagine would make it very difficult for me to go to the extent that I have been able to go to being in Warwick. So it created a safe distance where I was able to go back, collect data, come back and examine and analyze the data from a safe distance that made me more confident in how far I was able to go. And my research, when I post it on LinkedIn, students in Kenya are resonating very much with it. And so the scholarship gives the luxury of distance, and that amplifies confidence in just how much the scholar can expose some of the issues that need to be exposed, because that's where change begins from. And now going back to Kenya, I want to turn my research into policy recommendations, which will benefit the entire, not just legal education, even though I analyzed the law discipline, but education in the whole country. And so I think that's one of the very great benefits that we do not need to overlook.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. Please.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shin Bin. I'm with Coventry University in the UK and Deakin University in Australia. And thank you so much for the talk. I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm learning a lot, actually. I'm in my second year of my PhD at the moment. Coming from the background in my research with the university alliances, and let me give you a simpler sense. It's a collective unity, looking at how universities they can actually work together to transcend and navigate, for example, securitization, geopolitics, et cetera, you can name it. And well, some of the activities the university alliances are actually doing, for example, that Emma mentioned, the future leaders training, nurturing the future leaders, etc., and also wider participation. So my question, I'm actually curious, can you comment, anyone can comment on this, like using university alliances or the, do you say this is a collective unity as a protective buffer in a way that can sustain global openness? Because at the end of the day, I think in the academic world, we try to have or cultivate that internationalization as a tool for global public good. So that's why I'm coming from the background in my last previous work backgrounds, building partnerships, and we see those partnerships break down. That's why I'm here. University alliances, the external forces. Is it going to help or it is not? So that are they becoming the instruments for regional blocks or national interests?
Thank you. Great question. Can I request that you are brief, because we will be able to take many questions.
Okay, I'll try very brief. My name is Ayomide Oladoshu. I'm from the Hang Seng University of Hong Kong. You've been talking about contradictions here and made me very curious. So my question would majorly go to Emma in terms of I want to understand the process of this policy formation, and the reason being that I do not know if the students' expectations are being captured in this, because I feel like there could be a disconnect between the policy goal of wanting the students to go back to contribute to their society versus the students wanting to come and study here. Because as a student, for example, I think the expectation might be that, okay, all of these scholarships are backed by the UK government and it is for talents mobility. But here's the Commonwealth scholarship saying, oh, we just want to train the students and send them back to develop their country. To cases we are seeing of students becoming irregular migrants, for example, or not finding jobs in their host destinations.
Thank you for that question. There was a question back. Yes, Noah?
Hi, Noah Silby, here in a personal capacity, but I'm Chief of Section for Higher Education at UNESCO. Just to connect to the comment about the global common good and sort of infrastructure, I wonder how much it would be useful to think about international student mobility as helping to create this parallel global infrastructure that I think universities offer extremely valuably at this particular moment in a fractured world. Creating this connective tissue and this circulation that provides for connections that are sadly not often being made in other realms.
Thank you. Please, Jenna, yes.
I'm Stefan. I work with the Mastercard Foundation at ASU. So I'm just going to expand on this question a little bit. I was just curious about how we are thinking about the students' agency in determining the outcomes. So for example, in Ghana, I know a professor who came back to Ghana after his postdoctoral fellowship. So he had finished a PhD. PhD allowed him to do a postdoc and took on a job, came back, started a lab, and succeeded, right? And I had a conversation with him when he said, it wouldn't have been possible if he came back after the PhD. He would not have been as successful. So my question is, how do we play these kind of different thinking of their agency and how they perceived outcomes in shaping these policy decisions.
Excellent. Let's take a few more, and then maybe panel members will respond to them together. That side, and then later here. Yes, please.
I'm Thais Bahia. I'm Brazilian. I'm a PhD student at Peking University, Beijing, China. And Professor Hearns is referencing all my PhD thesis. It's an honor. And you mentioned a lot of things that came to my mind. I will summarize. But my PhD thesis is about partnerships between Brazilian and Chinese universities. And I interviewed around 100 people, professors, administrative staff, and students. Two of the main, there are many, but two of the main challenges they're facing. First, continuity of policies. Professor Hearns mentioned that we don't need to politicize purity. And I started with 100 interviews. My sample now is 48 because many of these partnerships were canceled due to political misalignment in terms of you changed our president in Brazil, so we changed the dean, and they don't believe in China, and they cancel. And the second one, even when it's a struggle, but every year we have more spots, we have more scholarships to take Brazilians to China, vice versa. But one of the challenges professors are facing, how can I convince students to come due to the lack of knowledge and prejudice about Chinese culture and also Brazilian culture? Of course, there are two far countries, but we are living in a really divided world. So in terms of policy recommendation, I would wonder you, how can you do that? Because one of my conclusions and findings is professors are key. These, they are the real bridges. They cross the world and they go there and visit and establish the partnerships, and they come back and they convince their students go to China. It's amazing, a lot of opportunity and the way back. But how can you convince? Because there are like some scholarships that every year they're being wasted because the students are not applying. And also just in the context of US and Eurocentric mindsets, of course, rankings, and you know how rankings work. Everybody want to go to the countries, and how can you overcome this kind of pressure?
Thank you so much, please.
I'm Catherine. I'm a final year undergraduate student at University College London doing BA education. I think the idea of international student mobility feeds back to my dissertation on decolonized university, and then with a focus and inclusion on international students. And then the thing is that like there are panelists who mentioned the incoherence between like an inward hostility, like hostile environment, visa precarity and surveillance, and an outward advertisement to students of like scholarship, diversity, and the idea of like globalism and potentially soft power domination as well. But the thing is that if students, even though they have the scholarship or have the right, like superficial right to participate in a class, while there are possibilities for work and then truly enjoying university experience is very much limited compared to other citizens because of their not being able to vote while other citizens can vote, without not also limit the possibility of them going back to home countries. Because that feeds back to Maia's previous points about presence. How can we stay agile and then sensitive to these issues are tuned to change while the institution is very slow to respond?
And I will take the very final question from Lee.
Okay, Lee Runsberg, University College London. I don't realize this is a panel about international student mobility, but I wondered if you could maybe speak or reflect on the discussions or the politics within your respective organizations around maybe the relationship between the budgets that you have going to, say, scholarships for international students versus non-scholarship aid intended to be spent overseas on institutional development, capacity building in respective partner countries, and what that might mean for building on other kinds of mobilities, maybe on partners' terms. So allowing partner countries or partner universities to establish their own sort of mobility initiatives and schemes using, say, aid money or.
Excellent. So considering the limited time we have, I would like to give 1 minute to each panelist to selected questions, whatever they felt they were in position to respond. Who wants to start? 1 minute. Yes, please.
So on the question of the contradiction between coming here and going home, for me, I want to protect my budget. And if my scholars don't go home, I will lose my budget. So for me, it's really important that I can say to ministers, they went home, they used the development money for the purpose for which it was intended. Every student who applies for one of our scholarship schemes ticks a box to say they will go home. So they arrive fully understanding they're expected to go home. Yeah, it's really important that they do, because otherwise I risk losing the funding. So it's a simple, that's a simple thing. In terms of wider aid things, I would say, I know the aid budget is under really tight pressure. I hope, and we've got good examples, and Brendan's got good examples, I hope some of our scholars go home and deliver huge benefits from one person. We've got one, I think it's a Commonwealth scholar, she's given something like 2.5 million online GP appointments. One person set up an NGO that's done that. The amount of aid money you'd need to deliver that would be huge. And they set up NGOs that deliver education benefits, etc. So I'm hoping that through my responsibility for scholarships, we can deliver some of those benefits, even if we haven't got huge aid budgets to spend.
I would like to pick up on the university alliances and just emphasize that from the DD's point of view, it's really important. We see a clear complementarity between individual scholarship programs where we focus on the individual talent, and on the other hand, the structural support for universities in order to build up comprehensive schemes, and from internationalization at home to joint degree programs, etc. And there is, of course, we run our own programs in Germany, but there is, of course, this huge EU-funded program, European University Alliances, and we're very happy that the UK universities will be able to rejoin this as well, because it's Erasmus funded. And one last remark to overseas aid is I can only agree with what you said, and there are capacity building. This entails specific activities and requirements and so on. But as Emma pointed out, I mean, this is of course limited by the overseas aid budget, and there we are also not in a position to increase our activities.
I can go, sure. I'm going to respond to Noah's question. I really like the phrasing that you used about universities as connective tissues. I think I would just highlight that universities are spaces with saturated international diversity in ways that are unparalleled anywhere else in society. Within our single square mile of our campus, the saturation of the diversity of thought and idea that is present within that space is it's amazing what we do. And I think the question is about the extent to which we are maximizing and evidencing the broad scale and long-term impact of having that role on society. And I think we probably are not doing that. And we probably should be turning attention towards evidencing that if we want to counter many of these discourses that we find problematic about immigrants within society.
Yeah, I'll try to tie a few of these questions together. I think as Emma said, the expectations are quite clearly laid out to people that receive a Commonwealth scholarship. So it should be quite clear what is being signed up to and what the expectations are. So then, to speak to, the situation about Brazil and China, like having individuals have that experience and then being able to advocate and sort of promote it to other people in their spaces helps kind of build that connective tissue to a point where you can start to have sort of deeper institutional linkages, and it's a much more traveled pathway. And then that helps build this broader transnational space that universities occupy. I think the power and the soft power that universities have as actors and the agency that they have, I think, is really underestimated and underappreciated. I think we tend to think about things in the context of governments interacting with each other, but the connections and the partnerships and the cooperation that happen between universities across borders and multilaterally is really, really important. And I think Jenna's point is really, really important to kind of emphasize. Yes, I think that was 1 minute. I'm sorry. Next 5 minutes.
Thank you, Joonghyun, and
Yes,
Hans.
there are a lot of questions, but the thing I can answer to the question is, I think, the brain game and brain drain. So staying at the host countries or coming back to home countries. So of course, in the development perspective, I think going back to home country might be better, and it would exactly related to the contribution to the home countries. But I think it is our researchers' future work. So sometimes I think even if they stay at the host country, it might be greater impact on their home countries, especially in some particular development stage at home countries, right? So I think it is the scholars' mission to look at to the development of their home country, stay at the host country and make the connection with the home country and host countries and support each other, or just directly go to the home countries and engage in the economic development or like this. So that is, I think, scholars' work for future.
Hans, did you want to say anything?
Yes, thank you. Well, many interesting questions, and not in the time in 1 minute, certainly not to answer them. But one aspect that we haven't addressed and which aligns with many of those questions is, of course, the reality is that we talk about international mobility, but that's only 2% at maximum of the student population in the world has the chance to go abroad. Has the chance even to go to a transnational operation. So it's a very small percentage, and scholarship is even probably 2% of that 2%. So we're talking about a very limited number of students that are benefiting from mobility and from scholarships. It is also that only the most richest and the brightest have that possibility to get scholarships and get study abroad. So it is a very exclusive and elitist dimension of international higher education. And we have to be aware about that, because that means that we have to see how we can create international student interactions as a much more common good into higher education. How to deal with that. And then we have to look at different modes, and virtual exchange or collaborative online learning is one of the many ways that we can make mobility much more inclusive and have the possibilities of students and faculty to collaborate together. That, I think, is something which we seem to forget. Internationalization policies by governments and institutions are still very much focused on the mobility side, and so are by nature elitist and exclusive. And that we have to change by thinking differently about how mobility is only one of the many instruments, how we create a much more internationalization of the curriculum at home for all students. That, I think, is we have to keep in mind in all those discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will come now back to change, and we'll ask the concluding question of this panel. So if you could change one thing in how international education is funded, framed, or researched, that would most help to sustain or build genuine openness, what would that one thing be? And we will finish on that. So every member of the panel has an opportunity to name that one thing. You can take up to 1 minute again.
I'll be a lot quicker. I would like really more evidence of impact, because that would really help me make my case for why I need more funding. So please help.
Please continue. Okay, thank you.
So from the researcher's perspective, I really want to make the policy makings actually rely on the long-term global evidence. So actually, usually nowadays, they just based on the short-term and the national statistics or some data. So especially in the host countries. So for example, Commonwealth scholarship, actually, I would do the report and find a very important self-reported survey for the alumni. But that is actually they include longitudinal data, but actually it is cross-sectional data and with the retrospective questions. So also UK visa data is very important, and UK has very good process for tracing the people after entering into the UK with the visa status. After they leave, we don't know what they are doing and where they are. We don't have any information about after leaving these countries. So I think for the openness and the good research on this intersectional mobility, we really need very strong longitudinal and long-term data set. So if we don't have that kind of long-term benefit or the impact, actually we should just rely on the short-term rational statistic, and it will, I think, make stronger restriction on the international students in the policy. Thank you.
Brendan?
I mean, I think it probably comes as no surprise that I would wish that the international education debate gets separated from the immigration and migration debate. I think the overlap's unnecessary. I think historically governments have been able to garden wall those two things, but the creep of that debate into the space of international education has been very clear in even just the last couple of years. And if we push them apart again, that would be my wish.
I'm going to keep on the cynicism train. And I think I would, my concern is I think we can never have genuine openness so long as we work within systems that are designed to exclude and restrict. And things like tuition, the invention of visas, post World War II, these are systems designed by nature to restrict. And I would argue there maybe has never been genuine openness. And I think international students have never been divorced from migration debates because they need a visa. But I think I also want to end on hope. To say I think what we should be doing as a research field is thinking about how do we still reach towards that idealism. The field is that we tend to predominantly either focus on small scale studies of student experiences or large scale macro pictures of mobility patterns. And I think actually what we need to do is start shifting towards interrogating those systems of exclusion and asking questions about what does government and organizations need by way of evidence to also interrogate those structures. And I think Emma has given us a clear plea moving forward.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yeah, sorry for repeating myself, but one thing the DAAD has wished for has already happened. The UK has rejoined the Erasmus Plus program, but now we have to make a success out of it. The German universities, European universities, and UK universities, because if we don't, then it will also have an impact.
Absolutely. And Hans, to finish our panel?
Thank you. Well, what I would like to change, and that applies both to policymakers and to scholars, we have to be clear what are we talking about. I've said several times, there is not such a thing as the international students. There are a whole kind of variety of what we fall under that category. There is the difference between the credit mobility, the students in Erasmus schemes, etc., and study abroad schemes from the United States. There is the degree mobility. There is the people who take language courses or specialized courses for certificates. There is the refugee student. We all seem to think that they are having the same kind of issues and the same kind of identities, but they are quite fundamentally different. And we have to be much more clear in our policies at the national level, at the international level, and also in our research about whom are we talking about and what do we mean when we use the term international student in our specific context. I think that is very important since international students is a very multifaceted phenomenon and needs to have much more clarity in our approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to first of all say a big thank you to our panelists for being here. It was a pleasure hosting you, having you here, and thank you for your very insightful contributions. And thank you to everyone joining. It was great to see the diversity of voices from different parts of the world with sharing different findings from your ongoing or just finished studies. So this is the richness that CGHE brings to this department every year. So thank you, everyone. And hopefully we can finish on a hopeful note that we will see more diversity. We will differentiate our groups of international students better, which is a great point. We will generate more evidence and we will proceed with a bit of hope in quite pressurized environments. Thank you.